Music theory with one note. Modal chords built from notes outside the 7-note collection. In other words, from our Earth analogy, building chords off of the ocean notes, particularly in this case, the Ionian Ocean note and the Lydian Ocean note. In other words, from a Nashville number system, node 1.5 and 4.5. So get ready and some coffee, because although we're just playing with one note, it's a beautiful note. You are not required to, but if you have access to it and would like to follow along, we're currently in the one-note file of Modal Node System, MNS, presentation 1368, one note, modal chords built from notes outside the collection I plus Y plus. List of presentations, at least in this view, are on the right-hand side. Also noting in this one-note presentation, we'll spend all of our time on the music theory side of things, but we have another similarly numbered and named presentation or set of presentations where we actually build these tables out in Excel, practicing not only our music skills, but our Excel formatting skills as well for formatting's sake. Let's take a quick look at the fretboard to get an idea of our objective, remembering the fretboard is going to have the low or heavy E string, the one closest to the ceiling on top. In prior presentations, we talked about the idea that it would be nice to name our chords not by the note name, but rather by the Nashville number, which I'm calling a modal point, which you can also say by Nashville letter. In other words, if I'm building some kind of C major chord, then instead of naming it as a C major triad or C major 7 chord or something, we name it as an Ionian chord or a Nashville number 1 chord. If I play something off of the collection of notes around the key of C that is the Dorian chord, which happens to be in this case a D, instead of calling it a D minor triad, I would rather call it something that's going to be a Dorian chord or the 2 chord, Nashville number 2 chord. That works great, not only if you're playing in the major key, but also if you're playing from any perspective, meaning any modal point, meaning any modal being the tonic. So even if you had, for example, the Mixolydian node being the tonic, I'm not going to change the numbers. I'm going to keep them an absolute numbering system, and that allows me to name the chords from that numbering system no matter what the root is that I'm playing in. So that leaves us with a problem, however, because there are 5 notes, which I'm calling ocean notes. Those are the ones in the white areas here. And so what if we're going to be playing a chord off of those notes? I don't have a name for them because I've only named the notes from a Nashville number system off of those that are in the actual collection of notes. So traditionally, what would you do? Well, you'd have to say, well, if I'm in the collection of notes around the key of C and I'm playing something here, then it's going to be, this is a G, that would make this a G sharp or an A flat. So it would be a G sharp or A flat major chord or minor chord or whatever that we're building from there. But to do that, what do I really have to do? I have to shift the whole perspective up, right? I have to shift my perspective of the notes like this up in order to basically name the chord from, that perspective so that that node is in the proper collection of notes. Why? That is not the functionally best thing to do from a playing perspective, because from a playing perspective, I haven't moved to a different collection of notes. I'm intentionally playing a chord off of a note that is outside the collection. And this is the fundamental thing that I think could be done better. In other words, when you look at something like sheet music, they kind of give you an indication of which collection of notes that we are in by having the numbers of sharps and flats, which basically gives you the chords that we are in. But a lot of times in tablature, or if you're just basically writing note chords down that you're going to be putting next to the words in the song, and in a DAW system, there's no indication of the collection of notes. We just have stacked notes on top of each other. We saw that one problem with that is that you can't really determine a chord. You have to know music theory to see the chord, because you're like, oh, I see that there's a distance in the stacked notes, which has a 4-note distance and a 7-note distance. That looks like a major chord. So that's fine, but it would be nice to be able to see that at a glance, to be able to pick that up as quickly as possible. It'd be nice to have a chord name that you can even put into like a DAW system for basic chords that would give you that information quickly. And the other problem that we have is that if I look at, there's nothing to indicate the collection of notes. So I have to actually look at the chords that are being played and say, oh, this looks like they're playing something in the collection of notes around the key of C, and maybe the tonic happens to be a G. So you could call that, it's a G Mixolydian type of song that they are playing. And I noticed that when they play a chord that's right here in the ocean, I've determined that they have not shifted the collection of notes, but that they're just playing a chord that's outside that collection of notes. And that's great that you can do that, but wouldn't it be better? Doesn't it make more sense that when you write down the song, I should be telling you what's the perspective of the song that I'm in? I'm in the collection of notes around the key of C. That's the 7-note collection. You could name that same collection of notes by saying it's the 7-note collection around the G Mixolydian, but now you're coming up with a whole bunch of different naming conventions. If you just name everything from the perspective of the major calculation, you only have 12 collections of notes in the standard collection of notes. So I'm playing around the collection of notes around the C 7-note collection, and I have the root or tonic that I'm visualizing in my mind right now, which is the Mixolydian, which happens to be a G in that collection of notes, right? And then when I play this chord right here, two things could be happening. Maybe the song did move up. Maybe it moved up like this, and now I'm seeing the collection of notes around C sharp or D flat, and I'm looking at that note. But more likely, it did not shift up, right? More likely, I'm playing a note outside of the collection of notes, which I want to know consciously, and I want to tell the reader of the music consciously by basically saying that's an ocean note. So I'd like to call it an ocean note. I'd like to say it's going to be a 5.5 Nashville number chord of some kind. Or it's going to be a Mixolydian plus or a Mixolydian ocean chord of some kind. Now, if the whole thing did move up, that's possible. I have a complex song and I'm visualizing it. I'm a jazz player maybe. Even jazz players are going to visualize from certain perspectives. So I was visualizing it from the collection of notes around the key of C, and then now I'm going to move it up, and the whole collection of notes has moved up. I would like to know that in that case, right? Then I would like to say, look, now I'm going to name this section of the song from the perspective of the different collection of notes that it is in, giving the context of that information. That information is really important, it seems to me, might not have been as important when all music was either in one or two modes, meaning major or minor. But when we're going around all of the different modes, it would be nice for us to use a perspective that we can tell the reader which mode perspective that we're in. That just seems to make the most sense. So what can I name this chord? That's going to be basically our problem. And the general idea would be, well, I can name that chord a 5.5 and then tell you the shape of the chord, meaning it's a 5.5 Ionian shaped chord. Or you can call it a 5.5 major chord if you want, or a 5.5 minor chord. So that would be the Nashville number 5.5 major or minor chord. But you can be more specific by naming the chord shape by the actual nodes or the modes, meaning if you say it's a 5.5 Dorian chord, when you come up to the different interval that's in the Dorian than to the Aeolian, that will become apparent, right? It'll be an easy way to say the shape of the chord that you're building off of here. So I think that would be the most efficient way to be naming all the notes, even building chords off of the 5 ocean notes. Now, I'm going to call this multiple different names. If you're using Nashville numbers, I'm going to say it's going to be a 5.5. You could technically say, if this was a 6, you can 5.5's in the middle. I'm going to call it a Mixolydian plus, which is going to be an X plus. You could call it an A minus, but I'm going to say the ocean's on the right all the time. So I'm going to call it a Mixolydian ocean chord as well. And those are going to be, the naming conventions that I'm going to have for that point, and then name the type of chord. Now let's give a quick reminder of the chords here. So if I look at like the buckets of chords, remember that you have a 3-note chord, a 4-note chord, a 5-note chord, a 6-note chord, and a 7-note chord. Now, these are the standard buckets: major buckets, minor buckets, 7, diminished, half diminished, and then you have your extensions, which are major extensions and minor extensions. These are all the normal chords that would be built off of the notes that are in the 7-note collection, going from a 3-note chord all the way up to all 7 notes. These chords, though, do not include then the notes that are in the ocean. So there's a couple things wrong or problems with these naming conventions. One is that they don't tell you in and of themselves the context within the song, because I don't know, they don't tell me the collection of notes that I'm in. So it's going to name it by note, which doesn't give me that context. The other thing that's going to be wrong with it is that it might not give me the information needed for those notes if I add to the chord that's outside the collection of notes, which we'll talk more about in a future presentation. So that's one of the things we've addressed in prior presentations. Let's do a quick recap. We're going to say that in prior presentations, we looked at the collection of notes, which I'm going to say is, A, B, C, D, and then the sharps and flats here are going to be labeled A sharp or B flat, because that's going to be a simpler abbreviation, just A, B, than to say it's A sharp / B flat for them. Then I gave a numbering convention. Now, our numbering convention here is going to be based off of the key of C, but these relative numbers will be the same from all 12 collections of 7 notes. Now, normally we just list out the 7 notes. So in other words, let's just delete this. Normally we would just say, okay, I'm going to say that the collection of notes around the key of C, if we apply our formula, is whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. So that would be giving us all the non-sharps and flats, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, which we can name with what I'm calling Nashville number system, or an absolute modal point system, which will not change no matter what the tonic is, meaning it's still going to be a 3 even if we're playing from the perspective of the Phrygian, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Now the problem with these numbers, however, is that they don't include the 5 notes that are outside the system. So I want to include them in the event that I'm going to be playing off of those nodes. Therefore, the full 12-note system of 1 octave can be numbered from a relative position by adding the 0.5 notes. So you have 1 and then you have 1.5. So 1 is Ionian, which I'm abbreviating here. I would call it an Ionian 1.5 Nashville number, which I would call an Ionian plus, abbreviated as an I plus. Then you've got the 2, which is a Dorian, D. Then you have the 2.5, which is the Dorian plus or Dorian ocean note, which I'm going to say is a D plus note, another way to indicate it. Then you have the 3, which is the Phrygian, a P. And then we have the 4. There's no Phrygian ocean. These are 2 land masses stuck together in our Earth analogy. That's going to be the Lydian, Y. And then you have the 4.5. That's an ocean note because it has a 0.5. Lydian plus or Lydian ocean. I'm going to call it Y plus. Then we have 5, which is Mixolydian, which is an X. Then you've got the Mixolydian ocean, 5.5. Mixolydian plus or Mixolydian ocean, which is going to be labeled X plus. Then you've got 6, which is Aeolian, A. You've got Aeolian ocean, 6.5. Aeolian plus or Aeolian ocean, A plus, and then the 7, Locrian, which I'm going to label with an N, and then it goes back to the C again. So this is 12 notes going around in a clock format. We're not taking into account octaves here, in other words, from the perspective of one collection of notes, in this case normally working in the key of C, but the same relative position being applied to all 12 collections of notes. All right, now this is going to be our intervals that we listed out in prior presentations in normal convention using scale degree intervals. 0 note away perfect first, 1 note away minor second, 2 note away major second, 4 note away, 3 note away minor third, 4 note away major third, and so on. Okay, so in prior presentations, what we did is we looked at each of the modal points. So instead of trying to look at all the different chords that fit into a bucket, it makes more sense to build the chords off of a particular node, right? So what are all the chords I can build off an Ionian node? From a normal naming standpoint, because they're named off of the major key typically, it's going to be the cleanest naming convention, C major, or it happens to be the collection of notes around the key of C, major 7, major 9, major 11, major 13. However, I would rather name it not by the C major, but by the node. Why? Because that's going to be more specific, giving me the information of the relative position of the song, and it's something that can be moved up to all 12 collections of 7 notes, which you can name then multiple different ways. You can call it an Ionian C2, which you can add the C if you want, or remove the C, just call it an Ionian 2. That's 2 modal half steps. It's a 3-note chord. 2 modal half steps is a distance term, as we talked about before. You can call it a 3-note Ionian, possibly removing the N altogether, just calling it a 3 Ionian. The note is going to be implied, the N is implied. You can call it a range chord, meaning it's a 1-5 modal range chord. In other words, it's going to have the 1-3-5 modal points. So I can just name the endpoints and take every other modal half step, which I can do if I keep the numbers the same. I can call it an IX modal range chord, which is just basically the modal points, meaning those are the endpoints of the modal range chord, which will be specific then to the Ionian, which is more specific than calling it major or minor. All right, so these are the modal points that we have here, and so on. This is the half steps that we have that we looked at in prior presentations. And then these are the intervals that we looked at in prior presentations, the modal distance, and then the actual note names, which would change in our Excel worksheet if we changed this cell so that we can have this whole thing populated for all 12 collections of 7 notes from the perspective of all the normal chords that are built off of the Ionian node, which are the major chords. If you look at the bucket of chords, the Ionian bucket is going to be here. They all fit nicely into the major bucket. All right, and then if we went to the Lydian, so we saw that we had the Lydian here, same kind of concept, but we had 2 extensions under the normal convention of naming convention. If you just call it a Lydian chord instead of an F chord, name it by the node, then it becomes a lot cleaner to label the chord for all the notes that are in the normal convention. And then if we went to our bucket over here, we saw that we still call those majors, but then it deviates and has these extensions over here once we get to the 11. And then we saw that we had the next one is the Mixolydian, same concept, but it has a whole different thing for the Mixolydian that has to be done under the normal naming convention. Aeolian still has the endpoint. This last one, which needs an extension, even though it's the main minor. These are the chords that are built off of the Dorian, and then these are the chords that are built off of the Phrygian, which needs these extensions after you get past the 9, because it differs from the Aeolian, and then the Locrian, which is the diminished chords. And then if I look at my buckets over here, you can say, okay, the buckets for the Lydian are here, those extensions, and then you have a whole nother bucket that is added for the Mixolydian, and then you have the Aeolian, which fits into the minor, but you have an extension out here for the minor, and then you've got the Dorian that fits exactly into the Dorian, and then you've got the Phrygian, which deviates to extensions once you get to the 9, and then you've got the Locrian, which has its own 2 buckets for itself, this being the triad, this being for everything past the triad. Okay, so now let's say, what if we're going to build something off of the Ionian plus node? In other words, if I go back down here, we're going to say, I want to build something off of this note right here. So to do that, I don't want to name it by the actual note name, which would be a C sharp, because then, again, I'm visualizing from a playing perspective a whole different collection of notes, which isn't what I want to do functionally. I want to say I'm seeing that intentionally as outside the collection, which gives me purpose or a function to the song. Possibly it's there to lead me, to pull me into the Dorian or something like that. So I want to be building off of this node and name it either a 1.5, or you can call it an Ionian Ocean or an I plus chord. So by shape, I can just say, look, it's an Ionian Ocean chord, and it has a whatever, Aeolian shape or a major or minor shape. This makes sense functionally because if I'm building a chord out here in the Nashville number 1.5 or the Ionian Ocean or the I plus node, and it has a major shape to it or an Ionian shape to it, I know the shape, so I can just apply out the shape. It's going to be looking like this if it's what I call like a lean back type shape, which from a caged system would be a G type of a shape that's being applied to this node, the 1.5 node, which is a C sharp or D flat actual note. And if it was a minor shape, then I know what the minor shape is. So I can say it's going to be an Ionian Ocean, a 1.5 node, but it has a minor shape or an Aeolian shape. In that case, I'm going to take this third and drop it back here, and I know what that shape looks like. So I can be more specific with that by using each of the modal points if I was to go beyond a 3-note chord. So it might be a 6-note, Aeolian shaped chord, or a 6-note Phrygian shaped chord, or something like that. That gives me all of my normal kind of chord shapes that can be built off of the ocean note without having to re-visualize the notes that are on the fretboard. Now the problem comes in, however, if I try to actually name each of the nodes in that chord, which I would like to do from a functional standpoint because that would be good for like a MIDI system, and it could be good if I'm building complex chords or building them in a different way. And the reason it's a problem is because I would like to name the nodes by modal distance or scale degree. But I can't do that if I'm building off of a node that's outside the 7-note collection. I have to look at the distance from here to here, not by the distance in the notes in the 7-note collection by scale degree or modal half step, but rather by note half steps. I need to know that the third, in this case, if it's a minor third, is going to be 3 notes away, and the fifth is going to be 7 notes away, and look at that distance relative to the collection of notes that we are on. So that's going to be where it gets a little bit wonky, but again, you only need that if you need to know the actual modal points. From a functional standpoint, you just know what the shape is, and you can build the shape off of that node. All right, so let me see if I can remove these and go back on up. We are now building chords that are anchored in the Ionian Ocean, the I plus node, Nashville number 1.5, which happens to be in the collection of notes around the key of C, C sharp, or D flat. What kind of chords could we build? We're going to imagine that all these chords are going to be the most complex type of chord that we can build, which will be the 7-note chord, so that we can then easily go to the more simple kind of format of the chord, which would be a 3-note chord or a 4-note chord or a 5-note chord, and so on and so forth. So in other words, we could build a 7-note Ionian Ocean or Ionian Plus or Nashville number 1.5 chord that has an Ionian shape, or in other words, a major shape to it. We could build a 7-note Ionian Ocean chord or I plus chord or 1.5 chord that has a Dorian shape to it, noting that the Dorian shape could be a type of minor shape, but it would be more specific if you're adding the distinctive interval to the Dorian shape that is different than the Aeolian shape. So this is a way to give us as much diversity in the shapes as succinctly as possible. So you could just say major or minor if you want, if it was only a triad. But if you're adding 7, 9, 11, and 13, you could be more specific by naming the shape by the modal point, which gives you more information. So you could be building a 7-note or any other one, a 3-note, a 4-note, a 5-note, but I'm going to say a 7-note, the more complicated Ionian Ocean or I plus chord, 1.5 Nashville number chord that has a Phrygian shape to it. Or you could call it, the Phrygian shape would be Nashville number 3 shape to it, right? And then we could build a 7-note Ionian Ocean chord, a 1.5 Nashville number chord that has a Lydian shape to it, which would be a type of major shape. And we could build it a 7-note Ionian Ocean or I plus chord that has a Mixolydian shape, a type of major shape that has the flat 7, or a 7-note Ionian Ocean chord, a 1.5 chord that has an Aeolian shape, in other words, a minor chord shape to it, or a 7-note Ionian Ocean chord that has a Locrian shape to it. So those are the standard shapes that we can apply to the chord. All we have to do is say, look, I'm just building off of this node. This is the shape of the chord, basically major or minor, but could be more specific based on the interval shapes of the chord. Now notice the conventions that we had up top. I had a couple different ways that we can give a naming convention. One was, as we did it here, the number of notes in the chord. So it's a 3-note, in this case Locrian. This time I'm dropping the N. I think the N is redundant. You can kind of assume that it's a 3-note Locrian chord if I just had 3N to it. So in this case I have a 7-note Ionian Ocean chord, which has an Ionian shape to it. So that still works, but I can't really do what we did here, right? I can't say that we have a Locrian 2-modal half-step chord. Why? Because this 2 is not representing the number of notes in the chord. It's a distance term, meaning it's 2 modal whole steps, I should say, which would be 2 times 2 or 4 modal half steps. That would be the distance from the node that we are on to get to the last note in the collection of notes in the chord. We would skip every other note. In other words, you would be going from this node in this case, which was a Locrian 7, up 4 modal half steps, which would be 2 modal whole steps to get to the 4 node, which is the Lydian here. Now, the reason I can't do that is because I can't count in terms of scale degrees or modal half steps, because I'm starting on a note that's outside the collection, right? Because the modal half steps and scale degrees are assuming that we are counting from notes that are inside the collection. So if it was a scale degree system, what would I have to do? I would have to convert. I'd have to say, this point right here needs to be a 1, and then it would be 1, 3, 5, 7 from a scale degree standpoint. But I don't want to make it a 1 because that forces me to shift my perspective in viewing the collection of notes as though when I move down here, as though this whole colored system that's around the collection of notes around the key of C is now moving up in my mind to the collection of notes up here around the D major. And I'm only doing that to accommodate one chord construction. So it messes up your entire perspective of the core of what you're visualizing to do that. No, I'd rather say I want to have a relative perspective. All right. So then you can also say that you have the modal range. Now the modal range still works, but it's a lot more difficult to name a modal range chord because I can't really just skip every other note. Up here I can say, hey, look, this is a 7/4 modal range chord. How do I get there? You start at 7, and then you take every other modal half step, 7 around the horn to 2, and then 4. The most complex chord, 7, 2, 4, 6, 1, 3, 5. That means a 7-note Locrian would have the points of Locrian, Dorian, Lydian, Aeolian, Ionian, Phrygian, Mixolydian. But I can't count it out because I'm starting on an ocean node. So I can't take every other modal half step because I'm starting with a note outside the collection. The only way I can actually count that out is to take half steps. All right, so that's why then the real way you have to kind of name it would be with the number of notes that are in the collection of notes. So it's a 7-note Ionian or a 3-note Ionian Ocean with an Ionian shape, a Dorian shape, a Phrygian shape, or a major and minor shape. So then you could name it by modal range, but it's not as nice to be able to do that. But you could map it out because all I can do is map this out and I can still see the endpoint. I would just have to count out the notes within it using a half-step format. All right, so now so if I was to see the normal construction, what would I call this? I would like to call this a 7-note Ionian Ocean Ionian shaped chord. Normally, we would call that, it's a C sharp or D flat major 13 chord. That's what I pulled from up here, right? It would be this 13 chord, but instead of it being a C, we would name it by C, C sharp or D flat. That would be great, but again, it's forcing me to shift my perspective in the collection of notes in order to build that chord properly, instead of viewing it as something that's outside the collection of notes, which is clearly indicated if you're saying it's an Ionian Ocean or Nashville number 1.5 chord with an Ionian shape, right? And this one, an Ionian plus chord with a Dorian shape, which would be a minor 13 chord. In this case, it's not a D minor 13, which would be the normal Dorian shape for the collection of notes around the key of C. No, it would be a C sharp or D flat minor 13. But this doesn't indicate to me that it's outside the collection of notes. This Phrygian chord would be a C sharp or D flat minor 13 flat 9. This 7-note Lydian chord would, if it was a 7-note one, would be a C sharp or D flat major 13 augmented 11, because the Lydian has an augmented fourth, right? The 7-note Mixolydian, Ionian Ocean Mixolydian shaped chord would be C sharp or D flat 13, because it has a different convention than the major, because it has a flat 7. And then the 7 Ionian Ocean Aeolian chord would have a C sharp or D flat minor flat 13, because you still need an extension even though it's the minor mode. And the 7 Ionian Ocean Locrian would have a C sharp or D flat half diminished 13, right? So these names are doable, but they don't give you context about the information. And if you have to map them out, then they force you to think of a collection of notes that's different. Now, here's where it gets messy. Here, like if I want to actually name the modal points instead of just see the shape, I want to start at the 1.5 for the node that I'm measuring from. Just like we did up here, we started from 7, but now this 1.5 is outside the collection. So if it was a scale degree, I would make that 1.5 just a 1, and then I would say it would be 1, 3, 5, 7, but that would mean that I would be looking at it from the perspective of the C sharp or D flat, shifting the perspective. Normally, I can fix that by saying, no, I'm going to keep these numbers absolute as we did up here, and I'm just going to count up modal half steps so that I'm not including the node that I'm on. I'm going up but measuring from the 7-note collection. And that works great, but it's not going to work if we choose a note outside the 7-note collection. So what we need to do is I need to go from here to here to here and so on, and map it out in terms of half steps. In other words, if I look at my collection of notes on my table over here, here's our 12-note collection. It goes 1 or Ionian, 2, I'm going to skip 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then the notes in the ocean, the 5 notes we're focused on, 1.5, 2.5, 4.5, 5.5, and 6.5 are here. Okay, so then let's say that we want now to measure from this node, which is going to be 1.5. One way I can do that is to stagger this and say, okay, look, here's my 12-note collection. Here's the 12-note collection if this was the 1, right? So in other words, when I go up to the 1.5, if I want to go to the second modal half step or third scale degree and it has a major distance away, how far away is it going to be? It's going to be, let me see if I can, it's going to be 1, 2, 3, 4 half steps away. So that would be from here to the here, right? From the 1 to the third is 4 half steps away, right? What if I go to the fourth modal half step or fifth scale degree? It's going to be 7 notes away. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 notes away would be the fifth scale degree, right? But now it's going to be here. So what I can look up is say, find these, the 1, the 3, the 5, and return to me these items over here is going to be the general idea. So in other words, if I was to map out the nodes, I could say the nodes are going to be the 1.5 that we start on the major nodes, and then it goes to a 4, and then it goes to 4.5, and then to around the horn to the 1, which is Ionian, the 2.5, the 4.5, and the 6.5. Now again, to get to these distances, I have to actually count the distance in half steps, which is kind of ugly, not only because I'm adding the 0.5s, but because we have the natural half steps. There is no ocean note, in other words, between the 3 and the 4 and the 7 back to the 1. Okay. But you can do it, and if you were to do it this way, you can map it out in a DAW system, and it actually might be useful to memorize these because if you memorize these, they will actually be the same. In other words, if you were to memorize, hey, look, if I build something off of the Ionian Ocean, and it's a triad that I built off of an Ionian Ocean, a 1.5 node, the nodes that you hold down will be an Ionian Ocean, Lydian, and a Mixolydian. Right? I can name the chords specifically. In other words, it would be point 1.5, 4, and 5.5 modal points. And that will be the same for all 12 collections of 7 notes. So although it's tedious to do that, it's actually more useful than memorizing the notes that are in like a C major versus a D major and so on, because those are all different for all 12 collections of 7 notes. If you memorize this, it's all the same, right? Okay, so that's the general idea. Let's just compare them just so we can say, this is the Ionian chord, right? And this was the, can I move this down? This was the Lydian and the Mixolydian. So here's the Lydian and the Mixolydian chords. So let's just compare them to see if they make sense. They're all going to start on the 1.5 node. That's going to be the 0 modal half step or first scale degree. Second modal half step or third scale degree are all on the same node. That makes sense. Those should all be 4 notes up. And then the fourth modal half step or fifth scale degree are all on the same node, which makes sense because those should all be 7 notes up, which is standard for most of the intervals, for most of the starting points. And then the 6th modal half step or 7th scale degree is going to be different for the Mixolydian. Why? Because the Mixolydian has a minor distance, a 10 note away distance instead of the major distance. So that makes sense. The 8th modal half step or 9th scale degree has the same for all of them because they all have a local distance of that's equivalent to the second, which is 2 notes away. And then we have the 10th modal half step or 11th scale degree, where we have a difference in the Lydian, because the Lydian has the augmented 4th or 11th. And then we have the 12th modal half step or 13th scale degree, which is the same because they all have a major distance, which is 9 notes away instead of the minor of 8 notes away. And now I messed up here. So let's go to the minor. So here's the Aeolian, the main minor. And we can compare that to the Dorian and the Phrygian, and just to see if that kind of makes sense. So now they have the same starting point. That makes sense. They have the same third because that's going to be a 3 note away minor third. So that's the 2nd modal half step, 3rd scale degree. The 4th modal half step, 5th scale degree is all the same because they too have a 7 note away 4th modal half step or 5th scale degree. 6th modal half step or 7th scale degree. They all have the 10 note away minor 7. And that makes sense. We have the 8th note away 9th scale degree. So they're all the same except for this one because the Phrygian has a flat second, minor second. The 10 note away 11th scale degree is going to be the same because they all have the same they all have the same 4th modal half step or 11th, and then the 12th modal half step or 13th is going to be the same except for the Dorian because it has a difference on the 6th. It has a difference of a major distance of 9 notes away instead of the normal 8 notes away for a minor distance. Okay, so let's go back here again, and then one more time comparing to the Locrian. Here's the Aeolian and the Locrian. They have the same starting point, the same 2nd modal half step, 3rd scale degree. That makes sense because they have a minor 3rd, but the Dorian has a flat fourth modal half step or fifth. That's the 6 note away tritone. It has the same 6 modal half step 7th scale degree. It has a difference in the 8 modal half step 9th scale degree because this one matches what is on the Phrygian, meaning it has a minor second, and then the same on the 10th modal half step 11th scale degree and the 13th modal half step 12th modal half step 13th scale degree. Okay, makes perfect sense. All right, let's go back to here and then say, okay, so then everything else kind of maps out. So if you were to map this out, you can actually look at the modal points and we can still list these out, meaning I can know them not just by shape. I could actually map them out, which might be useful to memorize and is certainly useful if you put this into a DAW or something. It's totally doable to do. These are the note half steps, which are going to be the same distances, which are just taking the distance between these points. These are going to be the intervals. The intervals and the modal distances are not as useful because we have to look at them from half steps, which I always add at the front, but most people don't, meaning I say it's a 9 note away major 6. Most people just say major 6, right? But I would like to know that it's 9 notes away. That's the important thing. Here's the notes that are actually mapped out, and if we were to map this out into the buckets, these are the buckets, so that we would normally call them under the normal convention. So the 7-note Ionian is a C sharp major 13 major bucket. The 7-note Dorian is going to be in a minor bucket. The 7-note Phrygian, it has a minor extension. The 7-note Lydian has a major extension. The Mixolydian is in the dominant 7 bucket. It gets its own bucket. The minor 7-note minor is in the minor extension bucket, and the diminished is in the half diminished bucket. All right, let's do the next one real quick, if I can do that real quick. If that's possible to do quickly, we'll say then the Lydian. So now we're going to be in the Lydian ocean, which is the Y plus node. So if I look down here, we're going to say, all right, we did the Ionian ocean here. What if we were in the Lydian ocean? So I'm like, here I move up 1, or here I move up 1. I'm going to say now I'm in the Lydian ocean, or Nashville number 4.5, and I can build the same chords from there, right? So I can just do the same thing, okay? So I'm going to say, well, I'm in the Y plus or Lydian ocean spot, and I can build either a 7-note Lydian ocean or Y plus, or in other words, a 4.5 modal range chord, which has an Ionian shape to it, which normally would be the same shapes that we have up here, but now I'm just going to build them from the from the F sharp or G flat if we're looking at the collection of notes around the key of C. So this would be fine, except it's ugly, number one, and it doesn't tell you the context. It doesn't tell you that, hey, we didn't shift up. We're not in a different collection of notes. We're building off of the Nashville number 4.5. We're in the same collection of notes. That's why this is more efficient way to do it. So we could have a 7-note Lydian ocean Dorian chord, a 7-note Nashville number 4.5 Dorian chord, which again you could call this an F sharp G flat minor 13, but it doesn't give you the context. We can say that we have a 7-note. It could be, by the way, a 3-note, a 4-note, a 5-note. I'm just building the most complicated one. It would be a 7-note Lydian. So we could say it's a 7-note Lydian ocean Phrygian shaped chord. Or from a Nashville number system, a 7-note 4.5, 7-note Nashville number 4.5 with a Nashville number 3 shape, right? Which would be an F sharp or G flat minor flat 13 flat 9. If we did the normal convention, we could say it's a 7-note Lydian ocean or 4.5 Nashville number with a Lydian shape or a 4 shape. That would be an F sharp or G flat major 13 augmented or sharp 11. We could call it a 7-note Lydian ocean Y plus or 4.5 modal point with a Mixolydian shape or Nashville number 5 shape. That would be an F sharp or G flat 13 normal convention. And then we can say it's a 7-note Lydian Ocean Y plus or 4.5 chord with a natural number 6, otherwise known as Aeolian shape, which would be an F sharp G flat minor flat 13, or you could say it's a 7-note Lydian Ocean Y plus or 4.5 modal point with a Locrian or natural number 7 shape to it. So again, these would be really easy to give you the context of the song, and you can play it. But if you want to map out the modal points, then that's where it gets messy, because again, if it was a scale degree, I would just make this the 1, and then I would say it's the 1, 3, 5, 7, and so on. But by making it the 1, you have now shifted the collection of notes in your mind in order to map out those distances, which is what we don't want to do and typically avoid doing by using modal half steps. That's what I present to stop that. However, the modal half steps only work if you're measuring from a point that's in the collection of notes, which we're not doing at this point in time because we're starting in an ocean note. We're building or anchoring off the ocean. All right, so when you anchor off the ocean, you got to deal with some difficulties. You've got to deal with some difficulties. It's a little harder. So if we're at the 1.5, 4.5, I can measure that to the 1 over here, right? And do the same kind of thing and say, okay, that's going to be a major as well. So if I go 4 down, 1, 2, 3, 4, that should give us the third, the major third. And if I go 7 down, 4, 5, 6, 7, that should give us the 5th. So therefore, the third gives us the 6.5, and this gives us the 1.5. Let's check those two out. So I'm going to say, let's bring that back over here. We have 4.5, 6.5, 1.5, right? So those look like they're mapping out. Let's just do a quick check on them again. So we've got the Ionian chords here, and then we've got the other major chords, which are here. So again, we would expect the 0 modal half step first scale degree to be the same. Second modal half step third scale degree would be the same. 4 notes away. Fourth modal half step fifth scale degree would be the same. 7 notes away. The 7 half steps away. We have the 6 modal half step 7th scale degree is going to be different for the Mixolydian because it has a minor distance of 10 instead of the other two having a major distance of 11. We have an 8th modal half step 9th scale degree, which is the same for all of them, which is from a local distance, a 2-note away minor second. We have the 10-note away 11th scale degree, which has a difference on the Lydian because it has an augmented 4th or 11th. We have a 12-note away, a 12th modal half step 13th scale degree, which is the same for all of them because they have the same local distance of a 9-note away 6th. Which is the local distance of the 13. Okay, so undo, bring it back over. Let's look at the minors. Here's the Aeolian, and here is the Dorian and Phrygian. Let's see if I can make that a square too. That was pretty cool. Oh, whoa, yeah. Okay, so now we're gonna say that has the same 0 modal half step first scale degree. Second modal half step third scale degree is the same because they should all be 3 modal half steps up. The same 4th modal half step 5th scale degree because they're all 7 up. The same 6 modal half step 7th scale degree because they're all minor distance of 10 up. The same 8th modal half step 9th scale degree, except the Phrygian is here because it has a difference of a local difference of a 1-note away flat minor second, which is a minor 9th, if you want to say it as well. 10th modal half step 11th scale degree is the same for all of them because they have the same 5-note away perfect 4th distance for the local distance. 12th modal half step 13th scale degree, we have a difference on the Dorian because it has the local distance of its 8th modal half step or 9th scale degree, which or no, I'm sorry, 5th modal half step or 6th scale degree, which is 9 notes away instead of the normal minor distance of 8. Okay. And then we have if I compare these two, these two, which is you just draw it right through the, look at that, makes it into a square. I messed it up. Anyway, let's just leave it like that. We have the same starting point, the same minor third, but then we have a difference in the flat. The Locrian has a flat here, so that makes sense. And then it has a minor distance on the 8th modal half step 9th scale degree because it has a minor second like the Phrygian. Okay, so it looks muy B to the N. And then, of course, once we do that, I could then take those endpoints and still call it like this would be a 4.5 to a 2 modal range chord, right? Or in other words, a Y plus Lydian Ocean to a Dorian modal range chord. But that's not as useful because I can't really count the notes in between without doing the math like this, without doing something ugly. Although, so that's kind of the problem with those modal range chords that start from something in the ocean. So then we have the note half steps, we've got the intervals, we've got the modal distances, which are going to be, again, useful if you name the half steps or if you know the distance interval in half steps, right? That's going to be the most important piece. And then we've got the notes here, and then we've got the buckets that it would land into, same basically buckets that we have here. Now, this whole worksheet in our Excel worksheet, the way we built it will actually change from an beautiful Excel standpoint. If I change this to any collection of 12 notes, then that will shift up the perspective and all of these oceans will differ, but the concept will remain the same because we named them not by note name, but relative position, which again is the argument of the way I think would be the more efficient way to name the thing.